Today, Tobruk in Libya is a quiet place. Its harbour on the southern shores of the Mediterranean is virtually empty, but for the occasional tanker leaving with the country's most valuable commodity, oil. During the Second World War, Tobruk became a symbol of resistance to the might of Germany, as well as the North African campaign itself, as the fortunes of both Allies and Axis powers ebbed and flowed. In 1941, some 25,000 men from Britain, Australia, and a host of Commonwealth countries held out against the might of Rommel's Africa Corps from April to November. It was the longest siege in British military history. The quiet cemeteries at Knightsbridge and Tobruk itself remind us of the cost of the Allies' eventual victory. Even in this remote corner, some of the stones bear witness to the many small acts of remembrance performed by family and old comrades. But in April 2001, the Knightsbridge War Cemetery was one of several settings for a particularly poignant farewell. For it was the last time that the Rats of Tobruk Association would come and pay homage to their fallen comrades. Although the men who lie below the desert sand remain young men in our memories, age has caught up with those who survived, and it's time to say their last farewells. The Rats of Tobruk Association will meet no more.
When you get into the desert, it's exactly as it was, and that's an extraordinary feeling. But it is, of course, all very emotional, particularly when you get to these cemeteries. And there you see names that you come to look for names that you expected to see, but every now and again you see some name that you've quite forgotten, and you think, oh, Lord.
In June 1940, Britain faced certain defeat by Germany. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated off the beaches of Dunkirk following Germany's devastating invasion of the Low Countries and France. Although many men had been saved, most of their equipment was either lost or destroyed. With few friends left in the world, Britain's future looked bleak. Then on June the 10th, the Italians under Benito Mussolini declared war on Britain. With Germany dominating Europe, Mussolini needed to reinforce his status as an equal partner to Hitler. Control of the Mediterranean was central to his dream of building a new Roman Empire. But in order to achieve his dream, Mussolini would have to win control over the vast expanse of the African countries that make up the southern rim of the Mediterranean. Italy already had a toehold in North Africa, as Tripolitania and Cyrenaica in northern Libya had been Italian protectorates for decades. Colonial rule was ruthlessly enforced, and in order to help the process, an excellent road was constructed from Tripoli to the border with Egypt. But the countries that formed the southeastern edge of the Mediterranean, Palestine and Egypt, were under British control, including the vital Suez Canal. If Mussolini's vision was to see the light of day, he would have to defeat the British in Africa. With Britain so weakened, it seemed that that task would be easy. In the Mediterranean, the Italians had a formidable fleet. The British fleet, shouted Il Duce, will be driven out of the Mediterranean. And to back his boast, he had no less than 6 battleships, 21 cruisers, and more than 250 destroyers and submarines. In comparison, the British fleet in the Mediterranean was tiny. In June 1940, Britain didn't have a single battleship and only a handful of cruisers and destroyers. Yet despite their overwhelming superiority, the Italian Navy refused to come out and fight. Finally, on the night of November the 28th, 1940, some 20 fairy swordfish flying from the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious attacked the Italian fleet in its home port of Taranto in southern Italy. Attacking in 2 waves, these obsolete biplanes wrought terrible damage on the Italian ships. Although the Italian Navy would continue to harass the convoys of supply ships for the remainder of the war, its effectiveness as a fighting force had been significantly reduced. The Italian Air Force was more of a threat. It entered the war with over 2,000 frontline aircraft in the Mediterranean and was to pose a significant threat to Allied shipping in the first years of the war. But the Italian aircraft were designed and built at the beginning of the 1930s. By the time the war began, many of their aircraft were outclassed and outgunned. For example, when the Fiat BR-20 Ciccone first entered service in 1936, its stressed skin meant that it was quite advanced for the time. But by the outbreak of war, the Ciccone was showing its age. Its light defensive armament made it an easy target for Allied fighters. The Savoia Marchetti SM-79 Sparviero was far more successful, but its modest bomb load of 1,000 kilos meant that it had limited potential as a bomber. Although this Sparviero was developed from a passenger aircraft, it carried on in service until the end of the war. The Fiat C-42 Falco had sparkling handling, but biplanes were obsolete by the outbreak of the Second World War. Although used mainly in North Africa, some found their way to Belgium, from where they flew during the Battle of Britain. Needless to say, they were no match for British fighters. Other fighters were better. For example, the Macchi C-200 Saetta had supreme handling characteristics. In fact, the Spitfire was the only Allied aircraft that could outclimb the Saetta. Also, its strong all-metal construction and air-cooled radial engine made it ideal for ground attack, and several units flew it as a fighter bomber. The Macchi C-202 Folgore was a development of the Saetta, but with the addition of the Daimler-Benz engine that also powered the Messerschmitt Me-109. One of the finest fighters of the war, the Folgore was fast, maneuverable, and well-armed. It came as quite a surprise to Allied pilots in North Africa, who came to respect its potency. In 1940, the Royal Air Force was fighting for Britain's survival. There was simply not enough aircraft or crews available in sufficient numbers to mount a credible force in North Africa. Thus, the RAF had to make do with whatever it could lay its hands on. Aircraft such as the Vickers-Wellesley were obsolete when war broke out in 1939. But in the early months of the war in the Western Desert, they flew extensive operations against the Italians. Similarly, the Bristol Bombay had been specified to perform dual roles as transport and bomber. Although it could only carry 1,000 kilos of bombs, its low takeoff speeds and high set wing meant that it could use small, poorly prepared airfields, ideal qualities for operations in the Western Desert. Much of the heavy bombing work was left to the Wellington, as in the early years of the war in Europe. Its range of around 1,800 miles was certainly adequate for the vast expanse of desert below, but there were not enough available to make a serious impact. There were 5 squadrons of Bristol Blenheims in North Africa. Initially, these were Mark I's, but they were soon replaced by the Mark IV with its distinctive stepped nose. Although specified as a medium bomber and fighter, the Blenheim was no match for the fighters, and many crews perished due to limited defensive armament and minimal protection for the crew. The Martin Maryland was originally intended for the French Air Services, but when they capitulated in June 1940, the order was diverted to the RAF. Like the Blenheim, the Maryland was used as a light bomber as well as carrying out reconnaissance duties. In 1940, the Gloucester Gladiator was just about the only Allied fighter in service in North Africa. It may have been a biplane, but it was all that was available. It was during the defense of Malta that the Gladiator legend was born. 3 aircraft, christened Faith, Hope and Charity, kept the might of the German and Italian air forces at bay until reinforcements arrived. Although desperately needed during the Battle of Britain, there were 3 Hurricane squadrons in North Africa in 1940. Even though it's generally recognized as one of the greatest aircraft of all time, so few Hurricanes could not realistically maintain air superiority in North Africa. In October 1940, the Western Desert Air Force was formed to conduct air operations in North Africa. The strength of the force amounted to 3 squadrons of Wellington bombers, 5 squadrons of Blenheims, 3 of Hurricanes, and 1 Gladiator squadron. In addition, 3 squadrons of Lysanders were assigned to Army cooperation duties. Italy began its campaign in North Africa by invading British Somaliland from Abyssinia on August 3, 1940. The Italians had some 300,000 men, 400 guns, and 200 aircraft. Against them stood a small British force of a few thousand lightly armed men. Inevitably, they were soon driven out of the country. Emboldened by his success in East Africa, Mussolini decided to take an even bigger chunk of the British Empire for himself, Egypt. On September the 13th, the Italians invaded Egypt from Libya. In 1940, Libya was commanded by the great Italian aviator, Marshal Italo Balbo, who was far from convinced that the British were beaten and did his best to delay any invasion westwards. But on the 28th of June, he was shot down and killed over Tobruk by his own anti-aircraft gunners. Balbo was succeeded by Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, who likewise felt that attacking the British was unwise. It was not until September that he felt his forces sufficiently strengthened to risk such a strategy. Thus, on the 13th, Graziani's army of some 250,000 men, tanks and aircraft crossed the border and made their way along the coast road. Waiting for them were the 30,000 men of the Western Desert Force, commanded by Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor. But in overall command of British forces in the Middle East was Sir Archibald Wavell. The area over which this war was to be fought was totally alien to most Europeans. Most of the settlements were to be found in the strip of fertile land that clung to the coast. This meant that there would be few civilians to get in the way of the warring armies as the fighting ebbed and flowed from El Agila in the west and El Alamein in the east. It was and still is a vast, empty wilderness with no food and little water.
You wonder how in the name of heavens you lived for 8 months there in that desert. I wouldn't live for 8 hours now.
Water was very limited, and sometimes if your supply column didn't get up. One thing that the British Army were always strict on, you always washed and shaved, because otherwise morale would go down. But there were occasions when they had to say no washing or shaving because there wasn't enough water. And we used to have a system, for instance, when you made the tea, you made it in an open Dixie, and you boiled the water, threw the tea in. When you'd all drank the tea, you then had a rosto of who was going to get the tea leaves, so you could chew them to get the moisture out and then spit the tea leaves out. It was a ghastly thing, but very welcome.
The terrain dictated that a very different sort of war would be fought to that which had begun in Europe. tanks were to play a critical role in the Western Desert campaigns.
Well, I mean, the tanks were these called ships of the desert, you see. You look out there, it's like an ocean, except it's an ocean of sand. And there will be tanks or vehicles here and here, and they will be spot each other on the horizon and open fire, much like a war between warships, battleships, destroyers, whatever. And really, that's what it was like, you know, and everything was at long distance.
The ocean of rocks and scrub is broken up by small ridges and depressions which assumed great tactical importance during the fighting. But dominating the terrain is one natural feature, the 500-foot escarpment above Saloum that was virtually impassable to wheeled vehicles and tanks except at 3 points, Fouka, Al-Faya and Sidi Rezeg. Needless to say, these points became some of the most bitterly fought over, time and time again, during the next 3 years. It would require an enormous logistical effort to keep the armies supplied.
During the Gulf War in 1991, I was General de la Billier's Commander Supply, responsible for matters related to supply of ammunition, spare parts, fuel, food, and all the other necessaries of war. Not transportation, that was someone else's issue. And I was always struck while I was out there with the parallels that existed between what was happening in the Gulf and what had happened in 1941, 42, 43 in the Western Desert. An expeditionary force, long supply lines from the home base, tenuous supply lines going up country with no roads to speak of. Much of the work we had to do was off-road, and the only way you could do it was if you had total air superiority, which in the Gulf War we had and which very largely existed in the Western Desert for much of the time. No cover. You couldn't run and hide anywhere. Everything you did was laid out in the open, so that made the air superiority even more important, but it made the management of the logistics quite complicated as well, because you had to make sure that you dispersed your stocks, dispersed your assets, made sure that you didn't place all the basic rules that you ever learned, and perhaps didn't apply fully when you were running through the woods in Germany where people couldn't see what you were doing, now applied differently in the desert. And what was interesting was how we tried to compensate for the problems of the long supply line. We built a pipeline. You'll recall Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean at Normandy. Well, we had Plod, pipeline over the desert, and that moved fuel from Al Jabal at the base up country to try and put fuel in the forward dumps so we could make sure we had enough fuel to go forward with into Iraq when we went. And although we didn't go into the business of building railways like they did in the Western Desert, we had a road train, because Saudi Arabia, being the sort of country it was with its oil infrastructure, had masses and masses and masses of heavy lift transporters locally available, which the Allies were able to utilize to trundle up that one road called the Tapline Road, built again as part of the oil infrastructure. And so what ran on rails in 1943 ran on the road in 1991, but the principles were very largely the same, and the parallels were often quite alarming, really. Issues like water continue to raise their head for us, as they had in the Western Desert. Issues like fuel supply continue to raise their head like us, as they did in the Western Desert. Issues of forward repair and the distance from the base repair workshops that we were able to set up in Al Jabal were all issues that had to be considered. So yes, fascinating.
In 1940, the British defence line was anchored on Mersa Matruh. From here, O'Connor would be able to use the open southern flank to launch attacks on the long, vulnerable Italian columns as they made their way along the road. At Sidi Barrani, the Italians stopped. Several weeks were spent laying a pipeline and road, as well as encampments around the town. For the British, it bought time. Reinforcements in men and equipment, including 3 tank regiments, were sent out from England at a time when the home defences could least afford them. With his forces strengthened, Wavell planned strikes in the desert. The desert attack, codenamed Operation Compass, was launched on the night of the 8th of December. It was originally envisaged that the operation might be a raid in strength to undermine Italian morale. The attack on Sidi Barrani was pressed home by the 7th Armoured Division, the 4th Indian Division, and 2 brigades of the 6th Australian Division. Their first objective was the fortified camps 20 miles to the south of Sidi Barrani. The camps fell within hours, and some 20,000 Italians captured. With the Italians thrown out of Egypt, there was now the opportunity to continue the operation into Cyrenaica. The first target for the British was the fortified town of Bardia.
We came to Bardia, went through Bardia, after the initial attack by the Australian 9th Division led by General Morshead and Matilda tanks, I tanks. Bardia was a fortress commanded by Bergonzoli, General Bergonzoli, who was nicknamed Electric Whiskers because of his growth of beard. It was attacked initially after the land attack by 3 gunboats, Chinese gunboats of the British Navy, the Ladybird, Memphis and Orpheus, also by His Majesty's battleship Warspite.
The Italians in Bardia were cut off from their supplies in Tobruk, as O'Connor had sent a mobile force round the fort to take the road to the west of the town. To add to the Italian garrison's misery, ships of the Royal Navy appeared off the coast to pound their defences with even bigger guns. It was more than the defenders could bear, and after 2 days' hard fighting, Bardia surrendered, and 40,000 more Italians became prisoners of war. O'Connor now turned his sights on Tobruk, some 80 miles to the west. By the 9th of January, the port was under siege. Following an intense barrage by artillery, followed by a combined tank and infantry assault, Tobruk surrendered.
Vividly supplement our previous film and reveal part of the last phase of our operations against the port. The Italian gunners completely failed to hold up our infantry or tanks, and the swift capture of Tobruk paved the way to Benghazi. There were huge fires burning in the town and in the harbour. We'll get a closer view of them presently. Meanwhile, a new flag was hoisted by the Aussies, making it perfectly clear as to whom the place now belonged, and a wild gallop through the streets was quite in order. One Aussie assumed very high Italian rank and did his sightseeing by motorbike. In the harbour, ships were burning and oil dumps were burning. From these and a score of other fires, great clouds of black smoke hung over Tobruk. And the old Italian cruiser San Giorgio, having been hit by RAF bombs and fleet air-armed torpedoes, had finally been abandoned by her crew. Built over 30 years ago, this cruiser was recently refitted as a coastal defence vessel, and her guns played an important part in the defence of Tobruk. But now the San Giorgio rests on the bottom, a broken and battered hulk.
Compass was barely a month old, and already 100,000 prisoners had been taken. But O'Connor was eager to press on and take out what was left of the Italian 10th Army. At Bida Form, to the south of Benghazi, Graziani met his nemesis. After 2 days of bitter fighting, the Italians had had enough. O'Connor's force of 30,000 men had covered over 500 miles and had taken 130,000 prisoners. It was the British Army's first taste of victory following many defeats during the first year of war. They were prepared to press on to Tripolitania to seize Tripoli itself, which was the only port through which the Italians could bring reinforcements. But the Chiefs of Staff in London had other plans. The 4th Indian Division had already been sent off to East Africa, where they performed brilliantly, finally driving the Italians out of British Somaliland in February 1941. Now the experienced units of 8 Corps were stripped out and sent to Greece in what turned out to be a futile attempt at stopping the German onslaught. On February the 12th, O'Connor was ordered to adopt a defensive position in Cyrenaica. Despite the triumph over the Italians, British vehicles and tanks had taken a hammering due to the terrain. That very same day, Major General Erwin Rommel arrived in Tripoli. Mussolini had appealed to Hitler for help, and he got the best. 2 days later, the first units of the Africa Corps arrived. It would be another 2 years before the British would have such a golden chance to end the war in North Africa. Rommel believed that speed is the essence of war, and on arriving he flew straight to the front to assess the terrain and situation. He ordered that the first units of the Africa Corps should also be moved eastwards as soon as they arrived. Rommel lost no time in launching his attack on Mersa Brega on the 31st of March 1941 with 2 Italian divisions and 1 German. By launching his attack before adequate forces had been built up, Rommel hoped to secure a quick victory. His logic was that this would then bring support from Hitler and further reinforcements. The timing of his arrival could not have been worse for the British. O'Connor had been hospitalized in Cairo and his place taken by Lieutenant General Sir Philip Neame. A large part of his command had been withdrawn and replaced by units which were untrained and under-equipped for desert warfare. In particular, the tanks of 2nd Armour Division were in no fit state and were too few against the combined force of the Italians and Germans. Rommel's offensive was as decisive as the British victory over the Italians a month earlier. In order to try and stabilize the situation in Cyrenaica, O'Connor was sent from Egypt. But disaster struck when on April the 7th, O'Connor and Neame stumbled into a German reconnaissance patrol and were taken prisoner. Benghazi was given up as the Allies fell back in panic on Tobruk, which was already occupied by the Australian 9th Division.
So chaotic, you know. You see, you get a wide area like this, you look at it, and they're all flying back in different columns, trying to find a way, the best way to drive. And of course you were getting harassed at the time by Stukas and Messerschmitts getting strapped. So that by the time we got back, I think we'd lost 50% of our vehicles, a third of our personnel. So they were able to form one column, which was going to go to Bir Hakeim to help the Free French. And the rest of us were sort of pushed into Tobruk. Not with any plan, it was just that we had nowhere else to go. So we were pushed in there, and we were amongst some of the, what is generally termed the odds and sods of the thing there, and that meant we were only in for a limited period, you know, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. And then the rest of the battalions by then had withdrawn, got back to the Delta and Alexandria, we were reforming. So they sent a signal up, and the likes of us were then put on destroyers, taken out of Tobruk back to Alex.
It was at Easter 1941. I can't for the moment remember the exact date, obviously, but it was Easter, April time. We had come up from the Delta. The majority of the army were in full retreat, coming back through Cyrenaica. They'd left Benghazi, and we had been sent up to Tobruk to try and stop the advance. It was very disconcerting because the whole of the army, it wasn't the 8th Army then, I think we were called the Army of the Nile. The army was retreating, in headlong retreat in fact, and we were the only troops going west. Very disconcerting. We got as far as, I think, just over the pass into Libya, when a dispatch rider rode up the column with a thing they'd print. We'd said, close up, drive as fast as possible. And night fell, and we made the journey from from Bardia to Tobruk in the dark, and we saw lights over to into the desert, which we thought to be German, odd flickerings of light. We got into Tobruk in the darkness, and we were the last troops in fact. There was a hell of confusion at Eagle Crossroads, where 3 artillery regiments got mixed up in the dark. Had the Luftwaffe dropped some flares and dropped their bombs there, I think Tobruk would have fallen, because it was largely the artillery that held them back in that first battle.
On April 13th, Easter, Rommel mounted a hurried assault on Tobruk's outer defences. He was soundly beaten back, suffering substantial casualties in the process.
And I think the most vivid memory of the fighting was the weariness eventually, because the battle started on Good Friday and went on to Easter Monday, as I remember. I spent part of my time on the guns and part of my time up with the Australian infantry on the front line as a spotter. And so I saw 2 aspects of that first battle. The first part of the battle I was on the gun, and well, it was just gunnery, loading guns and firing them, and then I went up to the OP, and I was up at the OP when they broke through with their tanks, and we did at one period, were bringing down fire upon ourselves, and then turning and bringing fire nearer to our own guns than we were standing. When the tanks broke through, so the infantry came through. They'd lost a hell of a lot of men in getting there, and then there was a bayonet fight. And as artillerymen, we knew nothing about bayonets and fighting, so I took no part in that at all. I just stood there and watched it going on around me, and I was absolutely terrified. And it was the Australian infantry fighting the German infantry, and thank God the Australians won. So I had a rifle and a bayonet and a round up the spout, and that's all I did. And I thought, anybody comes, I shall just shoot them. But nobody. I think the reason they didn't, in a bayonet fight, it's an individual thing, and if anyone's standing passive, they're not looking at you. Thank God. And the most frightening thing, one of the most frightening things I've ever seen. Then the Australians won that battle. It took a long time, and they began to withdraw, and then the tanks withdrew, and a lot of German infantry got into the anti-tank ditch, and then we shelled that, and we killed a hell of a lot of men. A lot of Germans died that day. That was sometime during that weekend. I spent, I think, 2 days up there, and then I came back to the guns and carried on fighting again. But during this time, we'd had no sleep, and we were exhausted. I do have a clear memory of being on the gun. This is after I'd come back. Everyone's face was like, their eyes were like slits, all caked in sand, unshaved and dirty and desperately tired. And I remember someone handing a whiskey bottle. Where it came from or who it was, I have no idea. And I remember we all drank from it and passed it around and went on firing. The gun had lost all its paint and colour because it was red hot. It had never stopped firing. And then eventually, on some time, I think it was Easter Monday, the battle stopped, died away, and they withdrew. And we just went to sleep on the ground, just where we were just exhausted.
By now, the 15th Panzer Division had arrived in Tripoli and had moved up to cover the frontier on the Saloum-Capuzzo area. Tobruk itself was now under a state of siege.
In a sense, I think, any isolated garrison fighting an overwhelming enemy or a perceived overwhelming enemy gains a certain degree of mystique. It mustn't be underestimated also, the stage we were at in the war, we'd lost wholesale, right, left and centre, and the Germans seemed to be in the ascendancy terribly. So the presence of this bastion on the coast of North Africa, holding out against overwhelming odds, had a certain je ne sais quoi about it, a certain ring about it, which appealed to the British support of the underdog almost. There was that to it. But to look at it realistically, as Rommel was trying to move from the west to the east along the North African coast, it was a thorn in his left flank, which in an ideal world he would like to see rid of. It was used as a base, as you know, to launch an attack, to support an advance against Rommel in 1941, unsuccessfully, but it was there. It was a logistic base. If the British Army was able to move beyond Tobruk and push Rommel back, it would be a logistic base on their LFC, which would allow them to shorten their lines of communication and would allow them more effectively to conduct operations. Similarly, were Rommel to capture it, he could use it for the same purpose going in the opposite direction. So it was a pretty crucial piece of real estate for a whole number of reasons, including morale, logistic support, operational activity, and the conduct of operations by both sides in that part of the Western Desert.
Rommel's first incursion into Cyrenaica was a spectacular success, and although he was still not strong enough to push on to the Nile Delta, he had won the valuable airfields.
Well, it's a beautiful climate there. The sky is absolutely azure blue, beautiful. And we said, what's these moths? And there were stokers circling round, too high out of gun range. Then they disappeared, passed behind the cloud. Then he heard this roar. They had like a kind of a cowl on the front of them, which made a horrible screeching and humming sound. It was terrible. They come diving low straight over and machine guns and dropped these bombs, high explosive bombs.
Neither side was able to gain the upper hand because both faced enormous supply problems.
Both armies were expeditionary forces. They were a long way from their home logistic base and had to be resupplied from there. The Germans had a relatively easy resupply route across some dangerous sea lanes in that they only had to come the short hop across the Mediterranean from north to south, whereas for the British they either had to go through the Mediterranean, that long haul from Gibraltar to Egypt, very much more dangerous than the German short hop, or take it all the way around the Cape, which added weeks to the length of time it took to get anything there. But the essential difference was that the British had been there for some time before the war, so there was built in to Egypt an infrastructure in workshops, dumps, depots and other things which gave them a degree of sustainability that was denied to the Germans, whose links perforce were very much more tenuous than ours. That was a factor. Then the similarity between both of them was the length of their LFC as they went backwards and forwards along the North African coast, shortening and lengthening and shortening and lengthening, and the difficulties they faced in bringing stocks forward, dumping stocks forward, bringing repair capability forward, which is essential, and maintaining and sustaining their fleets and their soldiers at the end of what was a very tenuous supply line, again up a single road.
But on May the 15th, Western Desert Force attacked the Saloum Capuzzo area in an attempt to clear the escarpment above Al-Faya Pass.
There is Saloum, way out there, and we went all the way along that escarpment that you can see right round there, and by that time the Germans, the panzer divisions, were aware that something very wrong was occurring here, and they appeared on the scene. And there we met them. We and also some tanks from the 7th Armoured Brigade, which was way out on our left, we met them, and we had rather a nasty time, but we stayed where we were. But unfortunately, the infantry didn't back us up. I wouldn't blame the infantry. I think perhaps the plan was at fault, and they didn't back us up. And so at the end of the day, we were out there very much on the limb, and in the morning we were counterattacked, and we came back and back and back, and I'm afraid we were driven out of the hellfire, fought, which we'd captured so successfully, and some went back down at the top of the escarpment, and some came down the pass itself. And I stood on that pass with my light tank, because I was a reconnaissance officer, and I directed the traffic. And one of my friends, who in fact is buried in the Tobruk cemetery, oddly enough, he said to me as he passed by, he had fought in Norway, he said, "Peter, why is it I always take part in military disasters?" And because it was a military disaster by then, because we were being driven back. And so we went back and re-equipped, because we had lost a number of tanks, and that was what was known as the May battle to us, and in the history books was called Operation Brevity.
The success of the Germans under Rommel was beginning to have a detrimental effect on the morale of the troops. And at home, the British public began to wonder, how could the army that had driven the Italians out of Cyrenaica so decisively 3 months earlier be so roundly defeated?
The Germans were invincible. And let's face it, we were beginning to think so. Nothing had stopped them. In fact, the first time they were stopped was at Tobruk here. It was the first time they were stopped. So there was some little excuse, I suppose, for us thinking, oh, the Germans are here.
Churchill would have none of it, and ordered that a counter-attack be mounted immediately. Wavell protested that he simply wasn't ready. It was all to no avail. To underline his wishes, Churchill ordered that a convoy carrying a cargo of 220 tanks be sent through the risky waters of the Mediterranean rather than round the lengthier Cape route. The tanks were mainly Matildas, which had proved so successful in the first years of the war, but were now beginning to look obsolete. Its 2-pounder main gun was to prove useless in the armour versus armour contests that were to follow. The Matildas were joined by a new cruiser tank, the Crusader. Although it had less protective armour, the Crusader had the same gun, and at 30 miles an hour it was twice as fast. The widely different top speeds meant that the Matilda and Crusader could not easily operate together. The Matilda and Crusader were complemented by the arrival of the smaller American-built Stuart M3 tank, renamed the Honey by British crews. The tanks were enough to re-equip 7th Armoured Division. Operation Battle Axe was launched on June the 15th. It took just 2 days for the plan to be added to the litany of failure. Not only did the Germans have superior armour, but they also began using the 88mm anti-aircraft gun against British armour, inflicting heavy tank losses.
There were many more tanks, because there was a whole new armoured brigade, or different armoured brigade, had been equipped and came up now on our left. But the Germans were very ready for us now, and the commander, the man called General Beresford Pierce, and we were under an Indian infantry major general called Masavi, who knew nothing of tanks at all. And unbelievably, their plan was the same one as had occurred the previous month of May. And of course, the Germans had prepared a defense against any such repetition of that. And that defense mainly consisted of bringing out big guns, such as 88mm guns, and even some naval guns, which I later was able to examine. This time we attacked at the top, and we also had 2 troops taken away from us and put under command of infantry to come along this very road here. And they were to attack right through there, and were expected to go up the Saloum Pass, which was an absurd thing to expect them to do, especially as this side of the Saloum Pass the Germans had mined between the sea and the escarpment. And to take the story of those 2 troops, they ran into the minefield. They were, all of them, disabled by mines, one man was killed, and one officer was killed, several soldiers were killed, and the remaining troop leader got the rest of them out and was given a military cross for doing so. The rest of us attacked at the top of the hill, as I say, and our sea squadron was completely destroyed, absolutely destroyed, every single tank by these big guns in Hellfire Pass. And the last message that came from the squadron commander, whose name was Major Miles, was, "These bloody guns are tearing my tanks to pieces." And that was the last word we had from him before he himself was torn to pieces. That left our other two squadrons, who were instructed to continue along the same way as we had gone before. And once again, the Germans had expected that this might be the case, and there was a ridge called the Hafid Ridge up there, and this they'd put into a state of mobile defense. They had tanks and they had anti-tank guns. And we ran into that, and we were brought to a halt, having lost about half the tanks we had there. There were two squadrons, the A and B squadrons, and we lost about half the tanks. We were then instructed to hold fast there, because the rest of the party was now going to have to be withdrawn. They'd scarcely gone over the frontier, let alone reaching Bardia, and Tobruk was but a dream. Now they had to be pulled back, and we, on our last remaining two squadrons, were asked to hold while they pulled back behind us. And this we did. And on the whole, it was satisfactory, except that we did lose a lot of tanks. And when we got back that night, I suppose we only had about 20 tanks left of the 80-odd that we started with.
The failure of Battle Axe cost Wavell his command. In his place came General Claude Auchinleck. Auchinleck, or the Ork as he was known, quickly found himself on the wrong side of Churchill when he resisted pressure to mount a fresh offensive. Without the confidence of his political master, Auchinleck's tenure in his position was always going to be weak. But Auchinleck refused to allow himself to become pressurized into resuming the offensive, and gradually he built up his forces. Meanwhile, Tobruk was being held largely by the Australians under their commander General Morshead, known as Ming the Merciless by his troops. Lord Haw had taunted them for their dreadful living conditions, that they were like rats. To the Australians, this was turned into a source of great pride, and the legend of the Rats of Tobruk was born.
During our stay in Tobruk, of course, we spent, the worst part was at the salient, where we were within, you could talk to the enemy practically, and you had to stay down below ground all day, of course, because put your head up and you'd get a shot off. And for all the day you stayed in your hole, the heat and the dust, flies, fleas and so on, and monotony. And of course we all suffered with dysentery, and that was a problem because you couldn't get up to go to the toilet or anything like that. So it meant on a shovel or something. But at night time we were up and out patrolling most of the time. We were told we had to make no man's land our property, so we did, backwards and forwards every night. And sometimes we would just go out, just sort of annoy the enemy, tie something on their wires so they'd know that we'd been right up against them and sort of keep them on their feet. Other times we'd go out on the fighting patrol, which might be 10, 15 men, and shoot up a machine gun post and come back again, or an artillery gun that was causing us any trouble. We'd go out and attack that, try and put them out of action, and sort of just kept busy. But the salient, of course, we were only there for 2 or 3 weeks each time, and they'd bring us out and another battalion would go in.
Though the waves may wash away the writing in the sand, that word will be indelibly written in the history of the Empire. The sea bathing at Tobruk, pleasant enough, but quite often under fire. The harbour, though fairly full of wrecks, is still perfectly usable, and stores are regularly landed there, though frequently under heavy artillery fire. The spirit of Tobruk's gallant defenders, men from Britain, from Australia and from India, is indomitable. Their typical sense of humor never deserts them, however tough the life may be, and that's one of the best reasons why they'll eventually defeat the Axis. The town itself is a bit of a mess, not that that worries the defenders. The enemy left a good many souvenirs in the form of scrap metal, and they also left this mule, which has been adopted for the duration. Another refugee, a baby donkey wounded by a shell splinter. Pets are not only popular, but useful. While master cleans up, he mounts guard. Fighting goes on all the time, of course. Our patrols go out far into enemy territory, often leaving behind them proof of their progress. V marks the spot. Enemy guns go into action. And the bush artillery replies. This is a now famous improvised unit composed mainly of cooks who fire captured Italian guns. As the guns have no proper sights, this is how they lay them. An Italian oil dump set on fire by enemy shells. An Italian ammunition dump hit by a bomb.
The food, well, to be quite honest, all I remember is bullion biscuits. Bullion biscuits, and the Aussies used to come down for our rum, which the officers used to give them, and then they gave us tins of beautiful sausage. Oh, they were delicious. And we used to go around scrounging around the bomb buildings, perhaps we could find tins of food. And luckily, I found a rather large tin of Italian biscuits. They were rock hard, we used to soak them in water, the bully, and the biscuits, and make a kind of a soup out of it. There's a change, you see. But the water was the worst. A third salt and 2/3 fresh water. That was our ration daily. One of the army type bottles, you know, cans, whatever they call them.
Although Tobruk has had a pretty good bashing, it still holds out. More than that, it's a real thorn in the enemy's side. In spite of air raids and bombardments, the life of the stout-hearted garrison goes on almost as if it hadn't a care in the world. With a sense of humor, plus enough to eat, you can stick most things. Tobruk even has its own newspaper, and from all accounts, that's pretty full of humor too. Most welcome of all to a Tobruker, of course, is news from home. Letters arrive by sea, and good news is always celebrated. He's just learned he's a father. Don't think of Tobruk merely as a besieged garrison, but as an outpost from which the enemy are continuously harassed. Hence the prisoners, Italians and Huns. Apparently, desert warfare doesn't appeal to the German sense of humor, if any. But quite apart from prisoners, pets are very welcome in Tobruk, and they all get on admirably. Like these two. As you'll see, they've got a sense of humor too.
And they, like you could move around, as long as you didn't get in groups or anything, and you could get up in the daylight, and we used to work there reinforcing our defensive positions, digging the holes a bit deeper or connecting trenches and digging different positions and so on, and that's what we did. Like the work was harder, but at least you could move around when you came back to which we called the blue line, and then further back still where we were right out of everything. And occasionally, I remember having one swim. They took us back to the beach once and we had a swim, and that was then. Water was our big problem, of course. We got one water bottle full a day, and that had to do you for the lot, whether you're shaving, washing, the whole, of course you very rarely washed. We all smelled the same anyhow, so you didn't notice it. And you never had a chance to wash your clothes or anything like that. But monotony, I think, was one of the big things. Absolute monotony, nothing but flies and flew, and you know, you might go for an hour or even a day without anything. Wouldn't be a shell over or anything, and nothing doing, nothing to read, no radio, nothing like that.
But as soon as you opened any food, I suppose it was the moisture in the, you know, a tin of bully beef in the heat. When you open it up, it's sort of moisture, you know, see. And as soon as you opened them up, or you had a mug of tea, they used to swarm down, you know, and you'd have one mug of tea, 50 flies, and you're sort of trying to sort of get rid of them. And
following our second Libyan offensive and our second reverse in this phase of the Battle of the Mediterranean, there's been a lull in which Tobruk has been included. But Tobruk will play its part, we may be certain.
Desolation, complete, abject desolation, filth, squalor, dried feces, can't be possible, you can understand this, left by Italians, and Lily Marlene. Have you heard of Lily Marlene? The song? Yeah? Well, it came into being in Tobruk at 3 minutes to 7. It was radioed every night, Radio Belgrade, by a girl called Lala Anderson. And that came to be known by the Italians as the Canzone per tutti i fronti, the song for all the fronts.
The golden lantern burning knows you well and true. Your walk so soft and yearning, the bright desire of you.
One of them was saying one night, we had him singing Lily Marlene, and we gave him a clap. And then we had a chap with us, Peter Robinson. He had a marvellous baritone voice, like a bit Paul Robeson sort of. And he sang Silent Night. Well, there was dead silence while all his voice rolled out over the desert about midnight. And when he finished, everybody clapped both sides. Yes, it was wonderful. I suppose if there is such a thing as a good war, well, that's the way war should be fought.
Throughout the long, hot North African summer, the two sides glowered at each other. After his initial attacks failed, Rommel spent summer months reorganizing and preparing. Air attacks by Stukas only added to the garrison's discomfort.
You could always almost set your clock. There was usually a raid in the afternoon and usually one in the morning. We used to call them Stuka parades. We have a Stuka, oh look out lad, here we go again, you know.
Well, as long as you were up in the front line, they weren't a great, and a matter of fact, our best entertainment for a night time was watching the air raids down on the harbour. They'd sit up there like the tracers going up and coloured ones coming down, and they'd drop parachute flares, and you'd see all these lights floating down and planes coming down through the clouds, and you could sit up on the side of your hole of a night time and watch it.
The target was so narrow and restricted, you know, that was it. But whereas the perimeter, troops in the perimeter, all the horses were right round Tobruk, wasn't so directly concentrated, but in Tobruk it was definitely concentrated. As a result, there were 24 ships sunk in the harbour.
The Africa Corps included the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, the 90th Light, which was an infantry division, and the Italian Savona Division. In addition, the Italians had an armoured division, a motorised division, and 4 infantry divisions. Axis forces in Cyrenaica totaled 102,000 men, with around 400 tanks. During the summer, most of the Australians holding out in Tobruk were relieved by a composite British formation, the 70th Division, and the Polish Carpathian Brigade.
Oh, very keen to get into hand-to-hand fighting or to get to Hulse with the Germans, because of course they hated them. And they'd have fired off every round of ammunition we had in the at Tobruk. And the first night, if they'd let them, all they wanted to do was get out on patrol and shoot somebody. Yes, but you can understand it, of course. And to us, it eased the tension a lot. And they were different people and to talk to, and they were easy to get along with. And I suppose it did relieve it was something new. Yeah, and they come up with they send different ones up with us, go out on patrol with us to learn patrolling and where everything was, where the enemy was mostly situated and where the easy spots were and so on.
By November 1941, Auchinleck was finally ready. Operation Crusader was to be the debut of the newly created 8th Army. The 8th Army was commanded by Sir Alan Cullingham, who had made his reputation in East Africa. Under his command were 118,000 men with over 850 tanks and support from 512 aircraft. Crusaders' first objective was the relief of Tobruk and to drive the Axis forces out of Cyrenaica. By capturing the Cyrenaican airfields, some of the pressure could be taken off Malta, which was suffering repeated air attacks by Italian and German bombers. Malta was a vital strongpoint, and its relief meant that the Mediterranean could be reopened for convoy traffic. Meanwhile, Rommel had gone to Rome to seek permission to attack Tobruk between the 15th and 21st of November. But on November the 18th, the Allies struck first. As dawn brushed the horizon, Operation Crusader began. 8 Corps was to move on Tobruk, while 30 Corps to the south was given the task of bringing the Axis armour to battle and destroying it. The third part of the plan was the breakout from Tobruk, which began on November the 21st. The plan was for Tob Force, as it was called, to link up with the 8th Army to the southeast of the port. Sidi Rezegh today is a desolate spot some 10 miles from Tobruk's defensive perimeter. In November 1941, its ridge and airfield was the area where much of the fighting pivoted in what is recognized as some of the most confusing battles in military history. The first day of fighting on the 18th saw mixed fortune. 7th Armoured Brigade succeeded in capturing Sidi Rezegh airfield, while at Bir El Goubi, 22 Armoured Brigade sustained heavy losses in its failed attack on the Italian Arietta Division. Meanwhile, 4 Armour Brigade found itself locked in a savage encounter with a German battle group at Gabir Sala. By the end of the first day, the 3 armoured brigades were disposed in a roughly triangular formation with some 40 miles between 4 armoured at Gabir Sala and 7 armoured at Sidi Rezegh. That each faced a different direction only emphasized the fluid nature of desert warfare. German positions at Halfaya and Bardia were also bombarded by ships of the Royal Navy as the 2nd New Zealand Division advanced to Sidi Aziz in order to cut the German lines of communication. But Rommel was not convinced that this was a major British attack and continued to finalize his plans for attacking Tobruk. He ordered his armour to concentrate in the areas between the British and Egyptian frontier. But the breakout of Tobruk by the 70th Division on the 21st soon made him change his mind as his forces now faced attack from behind. As Tob Force pressed on to El Duda, Rommel ordered his panzers to move rapidly to Sidi Rezegh. 4 and 22nd Armoured Brigades, believing that the panzers facing them at Bir El Goubi were withdrawing, headed off in the same direction to join 7 Armoured at Sidi Rezegh. The plan to link up with Tob Force, however, began to run into trouble. Although Tob Force had done well to reach El Duba, some 4 miles to the southeast of Tobruk, it was facing much stronger opposition than had been anticipated. A bitter struggle ensued to keep the corridor open.
We fired so many rounds in that battle that we had several prematures which cost quite a few lives. The guns got red hot and blew up. It was estimated, or how many rounds had been fired, but I can't remember them. It was a fantastic number of rounds. I'm speaking personally, of course, now. I had reported sick. In the army, that means you've been to see the doctor. And he said, you should really be in hospital. You have enteritis, but you're needed on the gun. So, hard luck, old chap. And don't eat any bully or drink any tea. And as that was the only thing we got, he meant don't have anything at all. By this time, I was a sergeant in charge of a gun. And working a gun in action is damned hard work. People don't realise how hard work it is working a gun. And I found that a terrific strain. The weather had changed, it was cold and it was wet. I was sleeping at night, and we were all sleeping at night, in shallow slit trenches full of water. It was a hard battle for us. But every man sees a battle from his own eyes. The infantryman saw his, we saw our part of it. After the corridor had been driven through to Butch and so on, we thought it was going to last just a few days, but of course you know it lasted for weeks, and we had to hold a corridor. And in the original advance, the Germans had left a battery of guns, which was now in no man's land. And so they asked for volunteers, for someone to go and prepare these guns so they could be drawn in, and I idiotically volunteered. And making my way up there, sheltered with the, I think it was the Coldstream Guards, who had a dugout there, and was sitting in there when a shell came straight through the roof. It was only a canvas roof, it was sort of sandbagged, and crashed into the side of the thing, took a man's arm off, who was sitting at the side of it. It didn't explode. And with shouts of stretcher bearer and I made my way out. And then I went out across no man's land towards these guns. And I thought that every eye in the British Army, in the German Army, was watching me. In fact, I don't think anybody was watching me. Nobody was very interested. They were all fighting their own. Well, I did get out to these guns and prepared the first gun to move. And a driver came with a sandbagged gun tower. Martin, his name was, brave man. And they shelled him all the way. But he jumped out, he was a fantastic driver, backed the thing right onto the trail hook, and we hooked this thing and off he went. And I spent the whole day out there, and one by one we got all those guns in. And I spent the day with a companion, poor man, a dead man, from the Beds and Hearts. And he was lying behind the Sanger, and I lay with him most of the time. And I often wish I'd looked at his dog tags to see who he was, and I never did. But forgetting that, the interesting thing was that lying in the middle, I was watching both sides, and no one was interested in me. And so the stuff was passing over me, and actually I was probably in the safest spot of the whole battle.
At the same time, a ferocious tank battle was raging between 7 armoured and the Africa Corps for control of Sidi Rezegh. By the morning of the 23rd, the bridge was in German hands. 7 armoured was reduced to just 10 tanks, while the combined strength of 4 and 22 armoured brigades was about 150, although many were scattered about the desert. The Africa Corps still had over 170 tanks, and Rommel resolved to destroy 34 in a pincer movement and thus relieve his frontier garrisons. Over 250 German and Italian tanks advanced towards the British, who had the 21st Panzer behind them. At 3 p.m. the attack began, but the British armour, although badly mauled, was not beaten yet. 72 Panzers were knocked out, and at point 175 the New Zealanders took over 400 casualties before being stopped 6 miles east of Sidi Rezegh airfield. But Allied losses were so high that Cunningham was losing optimism, as he felt that in the prevailing chaotic situation, the 8th Army was unprepared to meet any possible Axis invasion of Egypt. Auchinleck flew up from Cairo that very same evening, but decided against abandoning Crusader, realizing that the enemy also had problems. Cunningham was to be replaced by Major General Ritchie. Then, in a bold move, Rommel decided to launch a dash to the border. But logistics, always a weakness with Rommel, had not been properly worked out. The panzers ran out of fuel, ammunition, and water. As Rommel made his dash, the New Zealanders headed for Tobruk. Working closely with one army tank brigade, they managed to occupy Sidi Rezeg after tough fighting. At the same time, El Duda fell to Tob force. By the end of the day of the 26th, 70 Division and the relieving forces were linked by a narrow corridor. With Rommel's armour being refueled in Bardia to the east, there was a welcome respite. But Rommel realized that his dash for the border had been a mistake and that the situation around Tobruk was becoming perilous for the Axis forces. He ordered his armour to turn round and make for Tobruk as quickly as possible. Dawn on the 27th brought disaster for the New Zealanders. 5 Brigade headquarters at Sidi Aziz was overrun by some 35 tanks, which came storming across the horizon with the sun behind them. 2 days later, the Germans had reached Belhamed. The New Zealand division was now cut in two. Once again, Tobruk was surrounded. But exhaustion was overtaking both sides. The British, however, were receiving fresh reinforcements and new equipment. Rommel realized that he did not have the strength to continue, and on December the 10th, he withdrew his forces back to Tripolitania to regather his strength. Crusader had been a battle of nerves, and it had been Rommel's which had given first.
I remember the battery commander coming to me and he said, "Sergeant, the maggot is in the apple." I shall never forget him saying that. He meant the Germans were beginning to weaken. And I always remember him saying, "The maggot is in the apple." And so it was. And gradually we saw the German over on the escarpment moving westward, and gradually the New Zealanders came in. We welcomed them in, and we couldn't believe it. It was over, and the siege, which had lasted 9 months, was over. And it was a wonderful feeling that we've done it, sort of thing.
Ruwaisat Ridge in Egypt rises like a long brown wellback out of the sea of rocks that lies some 10 miles south of El Alamein and 20 miles north of the great sand sea known as the Qattara Depression. Had you been standing here in the summer of 1942, you'd have been standing more or less in the central point of the British forces' defensive positions. Here, they would make their final stand against Rommel's Afrika Korps in the battle that would be the turning point of the war in North Africa, El Alamein. 1942 began with America now in the war, following the Japanese attack 3 weeks earlier on the U.S. Pacific Fleet in its port at Pearl Harbor.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Now, Britain and her Commonwealth allies would no longer have to fight the war on their own. With America's industrial might turned to war production, the tide would surely turn. For Winston Churchill, it was, in some sense, vindication of his determination to hang on to North Africa.
It's an interesting comparison there between the attitude the British took when they started to resupply North Africa in 1941, at a time when we were under threat, we felt, from German invasion and couldn't spare anything. And yet Churchill had the vision to say, no, we must hold North Africa because we need to retain the Suez Canal and the Red Sea in the event the Americans become involved, and we will wish them to use that. And that was his reason for staying there very largely. And so therefore he was prepared to divert those resources.
Operation Crusader had gone well for the British and Commonwealth forces. The besieged garrison in Tobruk had been relieved the previous November, and the Afrika Korps and its Italian allies driven all the way back to El Agheila, whence they had started almost a year before. The British commanders began preparing for the next phase, the attack to drive the Axis forces out of Tripolitania for good. It was thought that Rommel was in no fit state to respond, but Rommel's armour had not been destroyed, and large numbers of reinforcements were arriving in Tripoli. On the 21st of January, Rommel attacked. British armour outnumbered the Axis forces by almost 2 to 1, but the Afrika Korps gained complete surprise. The British were easily defeated and chased from the battlefield in total disarray. On the 27th, the Axis forces attacked Benghazi. A mixed Italian and German force attacked from the coast road, while Rommel led another force through the hills to the southwest of the port. His attack was completely unexpected, and Benghazi fell. The loss of Benghazi was a severe blow to morale, as once again British troops were forced to flee eastwards. They coined their own laconic description of this seemingly endless ebb and flow, the Benghazi Stakes. At Gazala, Rommel halted in the face of the British defences that had been drawn up in the previous months.
We were in Tobruk for quite a long while. We were rearranging the mines out on the Gazala front. We did odd jobs around the harbour. We were getting fairly heavily bombed. And so much so that we moved out on the perimeter near Gazala and worked from there. The basic thing we were doing, somebody decided when they laid minefields, they would lay them in a pattern. One there, one there, one there, one there, and one in the middle. No matter which way Jerry came, if he missed that one, he's bound to hit the one in the middle. It didn't take into account when Jerry started to clear our minefields. It didn't take him long to realise, well, that's funny, we found one 2 paces back there. Well, they've laid them to a pattern. And that made life a lot easier for them. So then they decided that we went out there and we were sort of just untangling the pattern, making it more difficult for them.
The defensive system consisted of a series of loosely held locations, or boxes as they were called. Each box was held by infantry, artillery and anti-tank guns, but were spaced so that armoured units could manoeuvre easily between them to provide support where needed. Unfortunately, the boxes were too far apart and communications between them soon broke down. Rommel was giving the British a masterclass in mobile warfare.
Let's go back to those early operations around the Italian forts in 1941. It's actually quite easy to drive around a fort that's standing still. That doesn't mean you've adopted all the concepts of mobile warfare and the requirement that comes with it for a proper all-arms structure, integrated, working together, trained to operate together. You just drive around the fort. When you come up against an enemy like Rommel, which is also mobile, who has a mobile force under his hand, who is trained and who has trained his soldiers in all-arms warfare and the integration of all arms, including the Air Force, in their operations, you suddenly find that your use of armour in the way you used to use cavalry, and the independent use of armour and the independent use of infantry, it doesn't work. because you're suddenly up against a master tactician. And you suddenly realise you have an army where they're not trained properly to operate in a combined arms environment. And when I say combined arms, I mean the use of air power as well in this context.
On May the 26th, Rommel launched his attack on the Gazala line. At the same time, an attempt was made to outmaneuver the southern flank at Bir Hakeim. Here, the Afrika Korps ran into tough opposition from British armour, whose firepower had been improved by the arrival of the American-built Grant tank.
The presence in the Middle East of the American General Grant tanks was kept a close secret.
The Grant was twice as fast and had double the range of the Matilda, which had been Britain's main heavy tank. Its 75mm gun was also much more powerful, but its main gun was mounted in a pontoon on the side, which meant that it couldn't easily be traversed, limiting its potential on the battlefield. Although the Axis attack at Gazala and Bir Hakeim was being held, British armour was being deployed piecemeal with little or no coordination between infantry and armoured brigades. But Rommel was also experiencing problems. British armour concentrated in the Knightsbridge box meant that Rommel was dangerously close to being separated from his supply trucks at Bir Hamat. Conventional thinking would have made Rommel pull back to protect his logistical tail, but instead he renewed his attack on the 28th, pushing past Knightsbridge towards El Adem. A determined counterattack by British armour failed to break the Afrika Korps. By nightfall on May the 29th, the Axis armour was beginning to concentrate in an area some 5 miles southwest of Knightsbridge called the Cauldron. This shallow depression was the scene of some of the most desperate fighting on June the 5th, as British forces mounted yet another counterattack using infantry, armour and artillery. The Afrika Korps was almost encircled and their supplies were stretched. Initially, things went well for the British, but once again, coordination between infantry and armour broke down. Also, British artillery fire, normally so devastating, had failed to make any significant impact on the Axis forces as they were further to the west than had been thought. Confusion reigned, and the initiative passed to the Axis. By nightfall on June the 6th, the Cauldron was lit by the fires of over 200 burning British tanks. The 8th Army had also lost an infantry brigade and 4 artillery regiments. One of the regiments, all but wiped out on that day, was the 107th Field Regiment of the Royal Horse Artillery, the South Notts Hussars. Ordered to fight to the last round, Sergeant Ray Ellis did just that.
The Battle of Knightsbridge, of course, there's no such place as Knightsbridge. Knightsbridge is a spot in the desert which the British Army christened Knightsbridge. There's nothing there. It's a saucer which later became known as the Cauldron. We moved into that after firing a terrific barrage on the 5th of June, but I ought to say that we'd lost a lot of men just before that in the battles which still could be called the Battle of Knightsbridge, and B Troop, which held most of my friends because I'd been a long time in B Troop, were wiped out on the 27th of May. And I lost there a lot of friends. I was then in A Troop and the sergeant in charge of a gun. We moved in on the 6th of June for this last battle, and we were told not to move any uniform or boots or anything the night before, to stay fully dressed. We fired a terrific barrage and advanced, but we found that the Germans were not there, they'd retreated. And we advanced right into a trap, right into the Cauldron. We topped a ridge and ran into shell fire. And I was standing up in my gun tower with shells bursting all around us, and we drove through it. This terrific shell fire. It was airburst HEs, 88s, everything. By this time dawn was breaking, and we spent the rest of that day fighting in this cauldron. But this time there's no talk of last men and last rounds and so on. It was just normal battle. And then we went to sleep that night, and as I say, we were told not to. I woke early in the morning, before dawn, and two officers came across to me. Graham Slynn, who was a fine officer, one of our officers, MC and Bar, grand young chap as he was then, and he said, "We've had an order, Sergeant, we've got to fight to the last man in the last round." "Oh my God," I said, "not to retire." "Oh," he said, "don't think many of us are going to see the sunset today, Sergeant." And the man who was with him, Timms, who was all, he said, "Ought we to be saying this?" And Captain Slynn said, "Sergeant Ellis has been in this as long as we have. We're all in it together." And they moved away, and I said, "Good luck, sir." He said, "Good luck to you, Sergeant." And a few hours later, they were both dead. The Germans attacked, and we took them on open sights with 25-pounders. And fighting tanks with a 25-pounder is not a happy situation, because a 25-pounder is not an anti-tank gun, it's a gun howitzer. You've no protection, it isn't a good anti-tank gun. But there was nothing else, so we had to do it. And they came, and we fought them off, and they retired, and they came again, and we fought them off and retired. Their heavy artillery opened up on us, Stukas opened up on us, well, we died bombing them. And it was at 10 o'clock when they were making an attack, we were fighting, and I got a direct hit from an 88mm on my gun. I didn't know at that moment that I had. All I knew was I was spinning in the air. I didn't hear anything. I was just spinning in the air, and I hit the ground, and we got another one, probably from the same gun, and I went up again, twice. And when I came down, I think I was unconscious. When I came, I don't remember, it was very hazy, but I came round, the gun was upside down, and I was all black and blood here and there and so on. And my gun crew were lying around, and I moved, and I could move. I found out all right. I was kneeling for a while, and then I crawled round the gun crew. Some were obviously dead, but I ascertained that they were all dead. But myself lost a lot. And so I crawled behind the gun and tried to build a few rocks around myself, and the battle was still going on. And then I looked at the front. My gun had gone. That left 3 guns in the troop. When there was an airburst over number 1 gun, that's an airburst, is a shell that bursts over in the air. It came down and killed the crew. They all fell and no one moved. I realised that was 2 guns gone out of the troop. And so I crawled over to number 1 gun, which the tyres were all flat. The shield was all riddled. It was in terrible, but it would still work. And men crawled forward, and I fought that gun then, for the rest of the day, in fact. And I lost so many men on that gun. How I lived was a miracle. But as men fell, others came forward, and they were not all artillerymen. They were coming from anywhere. I can remember one was a Royal Corps of Signals. And as long as there was somebody there who knew how to work a gun, as I did, and I fought that gun until the end, and it was the last gun in the regiment to fire, as it happened. And at 6 o'clock at night, there were 2 of us left, myself and a man who I'd never seen in my life before. I was on the left of the gun doing the laying, and he was in the front helping to load the shell. And suddenly I heard a machine gun firing just behind me. They'd come round us. And he was just washed into the shield. He fell, and I braced myself, for mine, and I'll never know, will I? I'll never know whether the German gunner had compassion or ran out of ammunition or something else. That I like to think it was the first, that everything was finished, the guns were all, and I hope he thought, no. And because of that, I'm still alive. And that was it. The regiment was wiped out, it ceased to exist, and I was a prisoner.
Rommel's victory at the Cauldron now gave him the strength he needed to press home the offensive. His supply routes were secure, and although tired by the speed and piecemeal nature of the fighting, the confidence of the Africa Corps couldn't have been higher. The 8th Army, by contrast, was shattered. The infantry morale, having taken yet another hammering, began to look distrustfully at their armour. Rommel now turned his attention towards Bir Hakeim, defended by Free French forces. For 10 days, the French withstood ferocious attacks, but they couldn't hold out forever. No attempt was made by the British to reinforce this vital position, and so it fell, leaving the way clear for Rommel to roll up the British defensive line. Tobruk once more faced the prospect of being besieged, but it was not to be. The Navy had made it clear that it was unable to conduct the kind of resupply operations it had carried out in 1941. Auchinleck had also made it clear to Ritchie that he expected the 8th Army to hold a line that would prevent the port from falling. As a result, Tobruk's defences had been allowed to fall into disrepair. In June 1942, Tobruk's survival depended on strong support from a force operating in the area of El Adem and Bel Hamed. But the final action of the Gazala battles saw 90 British tanks charging into action against 2 panzer divisions of the Africa Corps. Over 30 tanks were lost in this desperate action, and on June the 18th, Tobruk was surrounded. This time, Tobruk held out for less than 24 hours. At 6 a.m. on June the 21st, the garrison surrendered. 32,000 prisoners, of whom 19,000 were British, passed into Axis hands.
I think my father believed that the fall of Tobruk was the greatest success he had in his military life. After Alamein, my father had no more victorious event.
Took Tobruk in 2 days, and that nearly broke our hearts. When we thought of all the time we'd been in, all the holes we'd dug and everything, all the battles we'd fought there, and in 2 days it was gone.
All the prisoners were starved because the Italians hadn't got any food. The Germans captured us, and they had to, by their own convention, to hand us over as prisoners to the Italians. The Germans did the fighting, the Italians did looking after prisoners and, of course, fighting, but we had to go to the Italians for protection as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. But we were treated very badly as regards to billets. We had no billets, we slept rough, and we had very little food.
We hung around here till almost the last minute. We got out by the skin of our teeth. The old man said, there's a 3-mile gap and we're going out, we're not going in the bag. He said straight out to us, we're not going in the bag. And we drove all night and got back quite near the border and pulled off the road, cut well off the road because you were a sitting target on the road for aircraft. Pulled well off the road and had a meal, rested for a couple of hours, and then 2 of the lads went out to get the day's rations, came back to the unit and said, the ration dump's completely deserted. There's millions and millions of things there, cigarettes, everything.
The fall of Tobruk was a terrible blow to British morale. Churchill was in America and was given the news by President Roosevelt in the White House. He declared himself the most unhappy Englishman in America since Cornwallis at Georgetown. One beneficial side effect was that Roosevelt authorized the immediate release of 300 Sherman tanks. Although it may not have seen it at the time, the Sherman would play a crucial part in the final phase of the war in North Africa.
Fire!
Rommel's capture of Tobruk was rewarded with promotion to Field Marshal. It seems that Tobruk had enthralled Hitler as much as it had Churchill. British forces now withdrew to Mersa Matruh, where a new defensive line had been planned. But with an exposed southern flank and insufficient armour to prevent such an outflanking manoeuvre, it was likely that the rout of Gazala would be repeated. Ritchie had determined that there would be no more retreating, that they would fight here or die.
We were on the top of the pass, and we were tail end Charlies, being the Royal Engineers, and we came down that pass late one evening and blew, I think, 2 of the corners off. Okay? Just hoping there weren't too many of our own lads stuck behind us, but I think we'd waited there all day, waiting, and 5 of our lads had been taken prisoner just before all this happened, and we didn't delay any longer. So it was a question of down, blow, and gently go back. No panic, just, you know, doing a job, and that was it. And we drove through the night, hoping that weren't too many lads, as I say, left behind.
But for Ritchie, there was to be no last stand. Auchinleck flew up from Cairo and took over direct command of the 8th Army as he'd done the year before. He had already decided that there would be a withdrawal to El Alamein. El Alamein was chosen because it's only 80 miles from the coast to the Qattara Depression, which is the great sand sea through which vehicles could not pass. Although defences had been prepared, the 8th Army had retreated in some disarray and was totally demoralised. The challenge for Auchinleck was to galvanise this force to stop Rommel in his tracks.
It was exacting, tiring. It was the patrol techniques that had been learnt in Tobruk were readopted, and patrols would go out for 5 miles or something in the night and come back again, run into a newly located place.
On July the 1st, Rommel attacked at El Alamein. For the next 2 weeks, he was to mount repeated attacks in an attempt to annihilate what was left of the 8th Army. Auchinleck had prepared his defences well. His battle plan was that the army should hold key positions at El Alamein, Rawayazat Ridge, and just to the north of the Qattara Depression. This would then channel any enemy advance. The rest of the army was to remain as mobile as possible in order to hit the flank and rear of any attack. As the Afrika Korps was repeatedly thrown back, the 8th Army began attacking Italian positions where it was felt morale was weak due to poor leadership and stretched supply lines. By the middle of the month, the equivalent of 2 Italian divisions had been removed from Rommel's order of battle. But poor coordination between armour and infantry meant that the 8th Army was unable to drive home any advantage it had won. Churchill, alarmed by what was perceived as a total lack of progress, flew out to Cairo to see for himself. It was a pivotal moment. Churchill made up his mind that the Middle East land forces needed some new blood. Auchinleck was removed as Commander-in-Chief Middle East and replaced by General Sir Harold Alexander. General Bernard Montgomery was appointed to take command of the 8th Army.
I think it was difficult, but he was determined. He'd been waiting for this opportunity probably all his career. And when it came, he was determined to grasp it with every possible talent in his command. And so what he did was to, within 3 weeks of his arrival, the Battle of Alton-Halfa took place, and then he had time to prepare the troops, train them, and get everything ready for the offensive action, and build up the supply of men and material which was needed if this was going to be a successful offensive. But of course the Battle of Alamein itself was a very tough battle, and he was under no delusions that the talent and the capacity and the ability of the German army was very considerable. He always had a huge respect, not only for the German generals, but for the German troops.
When Montgomery arrived in Cairo to start the process of taking over the Eighth Army, he and Alexander went to lunch to discuss the way ahead. And Alexander's remit to him was very simple. I want you to throw Rommel out of Africa. Montgomery said, will you give me a completely free hand? The answer was yes. Will you give me all the resources I require? The answer was yes. Unequivocally yes, in both cases. So Montgomery had his objective. He had the total support of the man who told him to achieve that objective, and he went away and did it. And that relationship never changed. When Montgomery said he wanted something because he needed it, Alexander said yes. How he retained his patience, Alexander I mean, with some of the things that Montgomery would get up to, where he would interfere in things that were none of his business, I really don't know. But he himself managed to keep that clarity of thought, which allowed him to separate the trivia of some of the things that Montgomery did from the objective he'd given to the man, and to ensure that he had the support that he required to achieve it. The length of time he needed to train people to use these new Sherman tanks that arrived, the length of time he needed to get his stocks forward, the length of time he needed to get his repair effort in place so that he could ensure that the tanks he was training with were going to be fit and ready to go to war, and that when they broke down or when they were damaged, they would be properly repaired and put back into the battle as fast as possible.
A new era was about to begin, and the stage set for the showdown between two of the greatest commanders of the 20th century. Both had gained their first experience of battle during the carnage of the First World War.
He made two big lessons. One was that he was horrified by the carnage of the First World War, and he was determined, for which he was criticized for being cautious, that you couldn't avoid casualties in war, but the important thing was to keep them to the minimum commensurate with achieving the objective. And the second lesson he learned, because when he was a staff officer, and when he was indeed in the trenches himself, he never saw any generals or knew what was going on. So he was determined, when he became to high command, that every single person should know what his job was and what his duty was, and how he saw and then what the outcome would be. So morale was he considered was a very big battle-winning factor.
It was very similar to Field Marshal Montgomery's experience. He thought that too many staff officers were too far behind and never experienced themselves the sufferings they asked from the soldiers. And my father was 3 times wounded in the First War, the Second War 2 times, and he believed that it's necessary that a general shares also the dangers of the soldiers.
His great quality was this ability to see with great clarity and great simplicity what needed to be done, and then communicate that at every level throughout the organization, so that when he'd finished, not only did everybody understand what he wanted to do, they believed that they needed to do it, and they believed in their ability to do it, and they believed in his ability to lead them to do it. It's just this purity, this clarity of thought, this pure objectivity that he had, and this ability to communicate it. He was a showman par excellence, but he won wars.
Montgomery faced his first taste of desert battle on July the 1st when Rommel struck again, this time at Alamein. Rommel's plan was to fight another Gazala, a feinting frontal attack accompanied by a forceful attack on the enemy's flanks, hitting his lightly defended rear and supply areas. But Montgomery was ready for him. By drawing Rommel in at Alamhalfa, Montgomery was hoping to destroy his armour by attacking it on 3 sides.
Our 4 anti-tank guns were set out in front with orders not to open fire above 300 yards. Fortunately, the first German tank stopped approximately 300 yards for us and therefore was a sit-in duck. The battle raged on for many hours. I think we knocked out about 18 tanks, but were then overrun, and consequently we were under fire from both the Germans and the artillery barrage from our own people. So we had to crouch down in the pit, wait for nightfall, and were then managed to scramble back and take our gun back to our own lines.
The Western Desert Air Force was also to experience the benefits of Montgomery's approach to business.
And this was Montgomery's first great success. When he arrived at his headquarters, found this flea-ridden, fly-ridden mess parked somewhere in the middle of the North African desert, and his first question was, would somebody please tell me where the Desert Air Force is so I can go and join it? He didn't quite put it like that, but that's what he went to do, and he sat alongside them, and from that day on, you only have to look at the impact the Desert Air Force had on Montgomery's first great battle at Alamhalfa. At night, he bombed the German tank concentrations, and he used the Air Force to start the process of crumbling down, grinding down the Germans from the very, very outset. And I think Rommel has written how surprised he was and how much damage was done by the Allied air forces. And in fact, I think I'm right in saying it was the damage caused by the Allied air attacks on Rommel on that first night of Alamhalfa that caused him to pause and think twice about whether or not he would pursue the attack, and caused him to turn his tack, not from going along the valley along in the direction of Cairo, but actually to turn left onto the Alamhalfa ridge to try and break it down, because he could see that's where the threat was going to come from, and he realized that it was much more of a bastion than he thought it was going to be, and it caused him to pause for thought. And indeed, there are some who say that against his better judgment he continued the attack on Alamhalfa, when his instinct said that he should withdraw and fight another day because of the damage that had been done already by the Air Force Army cooperation, and which he could see continuing. I think probably at that stage, the attack of the Desert Air Force on his advance made him realize for the first time there was a different man in charge.
Tobruk, which was quite a long way, in 7 or 8 hours, dropping 500-pound bombs on the harbour, and a lot well defended. I don't know how many guns they had, but there seemed to be a lot more, and they had, I'd say, about 5 or 10 searchlights, and I remember those very well because the thing that, the way the searchlight works, apparently they'd all go out and there'd be one blue beam left, and nothing had happened for about 10 seconds, then they'd all come on together, targeted on one aeroplane, and you just wondered whether you might be the one they targeted on. And we couldn't get great height, unfortunately, with Wellingtons because of the, I suppose, the bomb load and the thin air of the desert, but you were lucky to get a bit above 10,000 feet. And if you got caught in the searchlights, you found taking evasive action, you lost a lot of height, and as a result of that, you got down to 5,000 to 6,000 feet when the light flak came up at you. But that's only if you were lucky enough or unlucky enough to get beamed by the searchlights. And then it was a long, long way home, and you found after you had gone into the target that you were a bit worn out and dry in the mouth, and you, coming home you generally handed over to the second pilot for some other way, and strange to say you dropped off to sleep with a completely worn out. I don't know why that should be, because we were young and active and reasonably fit, I think.
During the early months of 1942, the Western Desert Air Force had been reinforced by the arrival of significant numbers of new aircraft types. The bomber force had been strengthened by the arrival of the Mark X Wellington, which had a greater range and had more reliable engines. The arrival of large numbers of American-built Douglas Bostons also greatly enhanced the RAF's striking power. The fighter force had also been dramatically improved. The Hurricane, although more or less retired from European operations, found a new lease of life in the Western Desert. The addition of 4 cannons under its wings made the Hurricane very useful indeed in attacking armour. Spitfire Mark V's also began arriving, equipped with a special cowling designed to keep the dust and sand out of the engine. The Spitfires and Hurricanes were complemented by American-built Kitty Hawks. The Kitty Hawk's toughness and reliability made it the ideal weapon in the desert's hostile environment. The defeat of Rommel at Alamein restored some of the 8th Army's lost confidence.
I think the confidence grew, now you believe this or not, when Montgomery took over. For the first time, we really knew what was going on. He got some leaflets printed saying, we stop here, we don't fall back any further. And as I say, what is termed as the first Battle of Alamein, that was at Alamein and Kidney Ridge, when they were stopped. We began to think, well, he told us we'd stop them, and we did, and it gave us confidence.
But there was still much to be done before Montgomery could consider mounting his first offensive. For the next 6 weeks, the soldiers were put through a rigorous program of training, and yet more training.
So it's not until Montgomery comes along and he realizes that although he has an experienced army on his hands in the shape of the 8th Army, he has an army which is untrained and has not been trained in combined arms operations. And there are loads of examples, if you read through any of the history books and talk to any of the people there, about the failure to understand, to comprehend the combined arms approach to the conduct of operations. You suddenly realize that actually we hadn't become stodgy. We always were, because we hadn't trained in a combined arms environment, and suddenly along comes this man, this genius, who has a very simple, clear vision of what he wants to achieve and how to achieve it. He develops his plan for the conduct of the operation, which will win, because he's determined that he will. And he trains his army to achieve his plan. And in training them, he brings in this combined arms approach, which he wasn't able totally successfully to inculcate into the 8th Army by the time of Alamein, which is why some of the problems arose during the battle. But nonetheless, he'd inculcated enough of it for victory to be the final outcome in what was essentially, I think, more of a slogging match than he wanted, but nonetheless was forced on him by the state that the 8th Army was in. And here I'm not talking about the quality and the courage of individual soldiers, not for one second. I'm talking about the fact that they weren't trained to operate as a team. And if you read Montgomery and about Montgomery, that word team keeps coming through I know it's overused in modern management speak, but he uses it all the time. And the 8th Army wasn't a team. The Africa Corps was. And if you're going to take on a team, you can only do it with a team that's better. You can't do it with a group of individuals. And in a sense, that's what he had in the 8th Army, not just a group of individual people, but individual organizations which tended to operate independently. And they didn't understand each other's capabilities. I don't think it was helped by the fact that the Matilda was called an infantry tank. Well, that kind of flies in the face of, what does an infantry tank do? No, sorry, let's go back to basics and start talking about the proper use of armour, infantry and artillery together in a combined operation, logistically supported by mobile logistic stocks which can actually replenish the battle you want to fight in the way you want to fight it, and the use of air power on top of all that and alongside it and around it to deliver the superiority you need, the umbrella you need, under which to conduct those operations effectively.
We became very proficient as a unit. It's different from just company training where you might be very proficient, but it's better if you've got the whole lot going and the CO tells you and everybody gets into the mood that what he tells you, you do. And we evolved that attitude very clearly. We were a bit pleased to perhaps join in the fray and resentful of the South Africans having lost Tobruk. There was a pride in going into the great diversity of people who were in a challenge in Nate's army.
New equipment was arriving in large quantities, including at last a 6-pounder anti-tank gun capable of doing the job. The Sherman tank also arrived. Again, the British now had a tank with a gun which at 75mm was capable of knocking out German armour. It was also reasonably fast and had better armour than its predecessors. The Sherman's all-round capability meant that it was to become the Allies' most widely used tank of the war.
We had learnt a lot of lessons. We learned how to retreat quite well, actually, but they got to the stage where I think the higher ups said, thought, right, if we don't break in this time, we're going to be here forever. And by then we had got a bit more equipment. The Yanks were in the war. They were pouring tanks in, Stuarts, Grants and Shermans, and we had the upper hand, literally, because before that we were the sort of underdogs, because you see they could manufacture things in Germany, ship it into northern Italy in about 3 days, down through Italy, 2 or 3 days across the Med, and very, within about 2 weeks of leaving a factory in Germany, it could be here, whereas ours had to go around the Cape. You're talking about 8 weeks, longer than that very often.
But as Montgomery's battle plan developed, it became clear that only a frontal assault would be feasible. And so, on the night of October the 23rd, Operation Lightfoot, the Battle of El Alamein, began. Nearly 1,000 guns opened up with a barrage that took the Axis forces by surprise.
We were waiting, we knew how to attack that night, and we knew it was going to be at 10 o'clock, and we were all waiting to go. And then all of a sudden, on the 20 minutes to 10, all the horizon just lit up. It was fantastic. You couldn't describe what it was like. And then as one lot fired, then the next lot was firing, and goodness me. And then there was a big whistle overhead as the shells were going over, like a very high wind or a big flock of birds or something. And then the crash, just as they landed, and explosions, of course, the noise came from the guns. And then the Germans started to fire. It was all real bedlam. It was, it sort of burst your eardrums. And it kept on going. And then, of course, at 10 o'clock, we stepped off and away we went.
Kept you awake. It was rather noisy. And you knew what was coming, so you couldn't go to sleep anyway, so the noise wasn't going to disturb you. You were just sitting there waiting to go in. You knew what was coming, and you all became an instant Christian and said your prayers.
Then when the time come and the moon come up and the hell broke loose, and it did, the whole sky was red. There's 908 guns opened up at a split second, and the boys was all waiting to go in. They're right amongst us, you see, and because we're like in the actual front position. And away they went, and the 51st Highland Division, they went in on the left with the pipes blowing all the way in.
As the barrage continued, engineers moved forward to clear lanes through the minefields using white tape and coloured lanterns as markers.
Well, the thing that struck me, there was no panic. The men we had trained, we'd had, I think, at least 2 nights further back we laid out a dummy minefield on our own, well back, down near Wadi Natroon, I think that's called. We laid out the thing. Somebody put dummy mines down while we were still back at camp. During the day they put these dummy mines down, and then we had to find them, and you called it gapping. You had to put angle iron pickets in, and they had bicycle lamps with a hood on it, facing back this way, so the tanks would come along and follow the lights through. But by the time it was dawn, not many tanks had got through because we were delayed quite dramatically, and there was no point in putting tanks through in broad daylight. In the meantime, a friend of mine, Roy Gray, was a corporal and an officer, went out in the dark, and just over this rise there was a burnt out armoured car, and they walked and counted their paces until they came to the German wire, so that they knew on the night of the 23rd how far they had to go. In the meantime, to actually find the mines, we had stripped down a vehicle completely, cab off everything, sandbagged the back, had a Heath Robinson traction put in the back like a round drum, made of mild steel, with a couple of rods going on a lever to the accelerator, basically the accelerator, and to be able to steer it. What do they call those blasted things? Tillers. Anyway, when the time came, this corporal started this thing up and he just drove it. At the same time, laying a tape out behind him, rolling off, so that people following up knew they followed that tape. And he had to drive that until he hit a mine. And he hit the mine, so then we knew where to start. So we went to worked to the left and to the right until we gradually clear it up. And then one party found the mines, another party disarmed them and sort of put them to one side. And about just before dawn, we had our first vehicles went through.
A feinting attack was mounted to the south in order to fool Rommel into believing that this was the main attack. But it was in the far north that the main thrust was to take place.
We thought then that with all that artillery fire, it would be just a walkover. We thought they couldn't possibly be really still alive, that they could have sort of stood all that and still been able to get up and fight. And so we kept as close as we could to the artillery fire, so as they were, when we got to them we thought they'd still be shell-shock and they wouldn't get up, but they soon pulled themselves together and started to fire back. And it was pretty rough going that first night, and we didn't get our objective. We got sent, and we lost all our officers to our captain, and that's our company commander, and our platoon commanders and platoon sergeants were all killed within the first hour.
In the weeks leading up to the attack, the battle plan had been revised, following the realization that the Axis weak points lay where the Italian and German forces overlapped. It was at these points that the most intense attacks were to be directed.
He was always, as an army commander, he would always be trying to find the junction point between the Italians and the Germans, not necessarily because the Italians were weaker than the Germans, although that was the case here, but because any army commander would try and find that junction point, because it is inevitably a weak point in the opposition's defences. But I don't think it was in his original plan. The reason he had to change to attack that weak link and to try and work his way around the back of the Germans the way he did was the fact that the armour of 10th Corps had failed in reaching its initial objectives and had taken far too long to reach its initial objectives because of the way it was commanded and led. It didn't seem to have the oomph behind it that Montgomery wanted to be put behind it, and so consequently he was faced not only with changing his main plan for Operation Lightfoot on the 6th of October, because he couldn't use 10th Corps as a corps de chasse as he had planned, but also then subsequently to adjust his planning, but then no plan survives first contact with the enemy, so he'd have had to adjust something anyway, but to adjust his planning to take account of the fact that all had not gone as he had expected due to the failure of the 1st Division and the 10th Division from 10th Corps to break through in the north with the speed and to the distance that he had anticipated and planned upon.
Meanwhile, the Australian 9th Division was making good progress at the northern tip of the line.
First time we attacked, the tanks couldn't get up to us because of the minefields. So we attacked without the tanks, but of course they drove us back. And we formed up and went again, and they cleared a gap in the minefields, and our tanks got through, and away we went, and well, we're going very well indeed. In fact, there was just a thin line of grey and they were running. And we were firing as fast as we could, of course. And then one of our tanks went over a mine and with a blaze, and we all silhouetted, and whether they got to their second line of defence and turned and gave us a little bit of a workout at that stage. And we went down, of course, and all those traces were coming at us, and I swear every one of those traces was heading straight for me.
But the Allies were becoming bogged down in endless attacks and counterattacks. Casualties were mounting too.
The trouble started after that. Jerry got a bit mad with us. He started counterattacking. And it was about the 3rd night, I think, that he broke through near the railway line on the road. And they sent our sister battalion in 2nd 28, and they were all taken prisoners of war in 2 hours. So they sent us in the dark, and A company was on our right and we was on the centre, and another company behind, and one company, so all 3 forwards and 1 reserve. So they said to the A company, said, if you get cut off, go back to the blockhouse, which was the old railway station. So one of our chaps, well, more than one got cut off, but one guy could see the blockhouse, so he scrambled away, because some lay there till morning and then crawled back to the... So he goes back to the blockhouse, and when he gets there, there's a German, either a sergeant or an officer saying, he said, all the Shermans to my left, and all your horse Australians to my right. He started walking straight into the German lines. You see, they had the southern end of the blockhouse, and we had the northern end. We changed places, because they'd broken right through. Now, the whole high ground on us, and it took us nights and days to clear it.
Then Rommel ordered his panzers northwards to help his beleaguered infantry. On November the 1st, the battle entered its final phase as the Allies mounted an attack on the Panzer's southern flank. With the Panzer divisions drawn into battle, the way was clear for the Allied armoured divisions in the north. Codenamed Supercharge, this phase was so successful that Rommel cabled Hitler seeking permission to withdraw. His request was denied. But as his losses mounted, an increasingly disillusioned Rommel once again requested permission to withdraw. This time his request was granted.
He became disillusioned because it was clear to him that the Germans will be defeated after Alamein. He saw the German advance to Alamein or to Egypt as a last chance to be successful in Africa, and afterward he had no hope left. And of course, he found out more and more what really happened in Germany and in Russia. And today we all know it was better to be defeated than to be victorious with Hitler.
In Britain, El Alamein was greeted as a great victory. For the first time since the war began, the church bells rang in celebration. In Churchill's mind, the victory heralded a new chapter in the war.
We have victory. A remarkable and definite victory. A bright gleam has caught the helmets of our soldiers and warmed and cheered all our hearts. The late Monsieur Venizelos observed that in all our wars, England You ought to have said Britain, of course. England always wins one battle, the last. We seem to have begun rather earlier this time. General Alexander with his brilliant comrade and lieutenant, General Montgomery, and gained a glorious and decisive victory in what I think should be called the Battle of Egypt. Rommel's army has been defeated. It has been routed. It has been very largely destroyed as a fighting force. The Italians were left to perish in the waterless desert or surrender, as they are doing by tens of thousands. Germans have received back again that measure of fire and steel which they have so often meted out to others. Ah, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
As Rommel's forces began streaming westwards, events in North Africa took a new turn. On November the 8th, an Anglo-American force launched a series of landings with the objective of seizing Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Operation Torch began with American assaults at Casablanca and Oran, while a combined force of American and British troops attacked Algiers.
What did the Americans learn from Torch? Can we go back a bit on Torch and talk about why it might have happened in the first place? We have to take account of the Russians, who were extraordinarily disappointed that we were not prepared to open up a second front in 1942, as soon as Hitler started the invasion of Russia. And something had to be done. Now, at that stage, the United Kingdom was not enough of a launching platform for France, and France was too well and too heavily defended by considerable German forces. You had in Churchill a prime minister who had always been fascinated by the soft underbelly of Europe, and so therefore could see the value potentially of attacking the Axis powers through the soft underbelly, particularly given the weakness of the Italians, the Italian government, the Italian army, the Italian armed forces. And it was a very good first step as a means of attacking Fortress Europe. Given Churchill's vision, he could almost certainly also see that if they tied the German army down in Italy, they couldn't be redeployed to help out in Normandy, and so therefore he was opening his own mini second front in order to ensure that he made the Germans look in as many directions as possible, so as to weaken them as much as he could in Normandy. So I think it was many things, and not the least of which was a first attempt at some sort of American-British cooperation in the conduct of an operation which, if successful, would divert German resources, although probably not shorten the war greatly. And if unsuccessful, there wasn't a huge amount to be lost in terms of the security of the United Kingdom home base.
On November the 11th, Algiers signed an armistice. The next target was Tunisia. If Tunisia were to fall, then Rommel would find himself wedged between Allied forces to the west and east. For the newly formed First Army, the attack on Tunisia was not going to be easy. There were few roads and maps were poor. Also, there was little information about the enemy's dispositions. The hilly terrain very much favored the defense, as the advance on Bizerta and Tunis slowed in the face of repeated counterattacks. The Germans were flooding the region with reinforcements from Italy and Sicily, while British and American supply lines became increasingly stretched the further east they advanced. However, Although it was the first time in combat for British and American troops of the First Army, they acquitted themselves well. 2 years of intense training were beginning to pay off, but First Army was a disparate force and there were the inevitable frictions. The Americans viewed their British counterparts as blue-eyed, pipe-smoking bastards with an elegant manner and no manners at all. They resented the British soldiers' superior attitude, born of having been at war for over 2 years longer. To the British, the Americans were brash amateurs with too much kit, but very little idea of how to use it. Events in February only served to reinforce this view. Meanwhile, the 8th Army pursued Rommel westwards. At one point near Mersa-Matruh, they nearly had him, but heavy rain intervened and Rommel slipped away. His retreat orderly and disciplined, ever ready to seize an opportunity despite being outnumbered. Montgomery, on the other hand, was cautious and refused to be hurried. He would fight this campaign on his terms and on his terms alone.
Rommel conducted a classic withdrawal in contact with the enemy, which is the hardest of all military operations to conduct, and he did it well. Montgomery's been condemned by many for not following it up. I think we need to understand certain basic facts. And I come back to the point about the state of training of the 8th Army. They were not trained in the pursuit. They didn't have the communications in place, and they didn't have the all-arms infrastructure in place to conduct an effective pursuit. And you'll recall that Montgomery had been increasingly disappointed with his armoured commanders, caused him to change his plan, caused him yet again to change his plans as the battle was going forward because they were not addressing issues in the way that he wanted them addressed. Indeed, on the verge of insubordination in the failure to translate their orders into operational action, in failure to translate his orders into operational action. He knew that the 8th Army couldn't do it, not that it wouldn't do it. And his great concern, I suspect, although I'm not in his mind, was that he would turn a victory for himself into a victory for Rommel. Even if it wasn't a defeat for Montgomery, he'd turn it into a moral victory for Rommel if he sent untrained armour chasing after an enemy that could then turn and smack it on the nose very hard indeed. Just once was all that would be needed. It would do nothing for the morale of the British Army, nothing for their allies, nothing for the very dented morale of the armoured corps out there. What he had on his hands at the end of Alamein was a complete victory. The army with its tails up. He'd learned an awful lot of lessons from failures in certain areas. He needed to remedy those before he could move on.
But Field Marshal Montgomery knew very well his victory is certain. There was no need to sacrifice soldiers. The end was to come for the Germans. And my father admired Montgomery because he was a very perfect military thinker. He even wrote to Hitler in one of his letters in 1944, "We must follow the example of Field Marshal Montgomery."
On November the 12th, Tobruk was once again in Allied hands. The port would help shorten the Allies' logistical tail. At El Agheila, it looked as if Rommel might make a stand. There were some within the ranks of the 8th Army who held their breath. They'd been here twice before. But once again, Rommel slipped away. All along the way, sappers and engineers had to search out mines and booby traps left by the retreating Axis forces. Finally, on January the 23rd, Tripoli fell. For Montgomery, the satisfaction of accepting the surrender of Tripolitania from the province's vice-governor was tinged with regret at not having destroyed Rommel's armour. The Italian Empire in North Africa may have come to an end, but there was still some unfinished business to attend to. Axis forces were now regrouping in Tunisia. With the Allied First Army completely bogged down, it was beginning to look as if the Eighth Army would have to finish the Germans off in North Africa. But Rommel, realizing that he was at risk of being caught between the two armies, struck first. He launched his attack against the 2nd US Corps at the Kesserine Pass on February the 14th, because he believed the Americans were inexperienced and therefore would be easily beaten. He was nearly proved right, but for a determined counterattack led by British armour and artillery. Then, on February the 16th, the 8th Army entered Tunisia, led by the 7th Armoured Division. Before them lay the Mareth Line, defences built by the French before the war to protect themselves from possible Italian invasion from Libya.
I have just received a message from General Montgomery that the 8th Army is on the move and that he is satisfied with their progress. Let us wish them Godspeed in their struggle, and let us bend all our efforts to the war.
Thanks to decoded messages, Montgomery already knew that Rommel was planning to attack him. On the night of March the 20th, the barrage began. The 50th Northumbrian Division led the attack on the enemy's frontal defences. There was severe fighting as they struggled to get tanks across the Wadi Zigzag, which formed a natural anti-tank ditch. Rommel, fearing another El Alamein, rushed his armour up to counter the threat. At this point, Montgomery decided to shift the emphasis of the main attack to the left flank, which was spearheaded by General Freyberg's New Zealand Division and 1st Armoured Division. With excellent coordination between infantry, armour and air force, the Allies launched their first blitzkrieg attack of the war. Waves of aircraft pounded enemy positions as tanks rolled forward at El Hamad. The attack was completely successful, and the 8th Army was able to cross the Mareth Line and head north towards Tunis.
I think by the time we reached the Mareth Line, there was a greater understanding of the combined arms concept, and therefore, yes, we had. We'd practiced it that much better, commanders knew each other better, and therefore we were probably better at it. There were still many of the wrinkles in the 8th Army that had existed at Alamein still existed, not the least of which was the personality clashes that existed between some of the divisional commanders and the corps commanders, and between divisions and within corps. And that has an effect on the way operations were conducted. But there's no doubt that it was a much better trained, better practiced army that assaulted the Mareth Line, and Montgomery could assault with much greater confidence, despite the fact he had a very long and very tenuous supply line going all the way back along the North African coast, with a degree of confidence, and he knew he was hugely superior in material anyway, and men. But really, I suppose the Mareth Line was not so much a case of would he win, it was really a case of showing that he could now conduct the orchestra that he'd built in such a way that casualties were reduced to the bare minimum, because they had become so much more effective together as a collective organ of war than had been the case in the past. Tanks were learning to work with infantry. Infantry were working with artillery. Artillery was working with both. It was much more a cohesive organisation. And of course you had the personality of this man, this amazing man, stamped over it all. His will just permeated through everything.
By the first week of April, the 1st and 8th Armies were able to link up and form a continuous line, hemming in the Axis forces with their backs to the sea. Their symbolic meeting threw up some stark contrasts. The men of the 8th Army came as veterans of 3 years' fighting. Their vehicles were battered and sand-coloured, and their dress almost casual. In contrast, 1st Army vehicles were freshly painted green, and its troops wore formal battle dress. Not surprisingly, then, that there should be some antagonism and rivalry as to who should have the final honours. The final attack, codenamed Vulcan, began on May the 4th. It was launched by the 1st Army, reinforced with Montgomery's 2 veteran divisions, the 4th Indian and 7th Army. By the 13th, it was all over. Bizerta was in American hands and Tunis in British. Over 200,000 German and Italian prisoners were taken, prompting Goebbels to compare the catastrophe with Stalingrad, which had fallen at the beginning of February. General Alexander was able to cable Churchill with the news. "We are masters of the North African shore."
I'm not sure we learned it in the Western Desert. I think the huge difference now is the very high degree of professional training that is given to officers at all levels and across all cap badges, and the total integration which currently exists not only between the teeth arms but with the logistics support that's available as well in a much more integrated approach than was the case there. The combined arms concept, the idea of combined arms, operating together, operating with Air Force, and all of those lessons which seemed so new and original in those days are now just taken for granted. And that, if it was a lesson of the Western Desert or just a gaining of an experience, I'm not entirely sure. But there is no doubt that the huge difference between then and now is professionalism at all levels, not just the individual training, but professionalism at all levels in combined arms operations, in working together, in integrating all aspects of an army's needs to produce the one outcome, which is victory.
Hey, turn! Rats of Tobruk, desert rats, by the left, into Tobruk, quick march!
On April the 29th, 2001, the Rats of Tobruk Association lined up for the last time. 60 years earlier, they'd fought for their lives as the garrison was besieged. Although many of those present had gone on to fight in Sicily, Italy, Normandy, the Low Countries, and up to the Baltic, it's along the shores of the southern Mediterranean that the sharpest memories linger.
Rats of Tobruk, desert rats, do your duties, dismiss!